All these photos you're seeing now have a softness and a glow to them that most people assume is done using a filter. However, I don't use any filters for my photography, and in this video I'm going to show you exactly how I achieved that look without any filters. Also, this video is sponsored by Squarespace, but more on them later on. You can't polish a turd. Now, it's not the most pleasant saying in the world, however, when it comes to photography, it is very true. If you take a photo in bad light, you can't expect to bring it back to life later on in editing, regardless of how much you push and pull all of the tones. So a soft image starts with a good source of light. Does that mean that you now need to head out at certain times to shoot a specific type of light? Well, in many cases, yes it does. However, you don't need to restrict yourself just to early mornings. As long as you have a good source of light, it's enough to get you going. Now, what's a good source of light? It's a clear and a direct source that's coming from a particular place. So that could be the sun, it could be a fluorescent light late at night, like a neon maybe in the shop window, or it could be a reflection, or even it could be a slightly brighter area in the scene. Next, you want to try and shoot as wide open as possible. So if your lens is at f1.4, try to shoot it at f1.4. The reason for that is lenses tend to be at their softest when they're wide open. However, there's a big caveat here. And that is, if shooting wide open means that your photo has no context, then stop it down to f4, f8, or whatever it needs to be in order to have context within your image. The outer focus elements of your image should complement the subject and the wider scene, and not just be one blurry blob with maybe one sliver of the image in focus. It just doesn't look very good. With the camera now set, let's look at how to shoot that specific light that I mentioned earlier. Now, I made a very detailed video about light. I've linked it down below, so do check that out if you want to know more. But in general, you want to be shooting either directly into the source of light or 90 degrees to the source of light. So if you're shooting that way, then the light is in front of the camera or it's coming from the side. What that means is that the light will wrap around your subject and give it a 3D and a more textured look compared to just having a flat lit image. And that goes a long way to make a photo appear softer because it has more graduation between your highlights and your shadows, and it generally looks a bit softer than a harsh flat light. And also it means that in most cases you'll have plenty of natural contrast within your image, which will allow you to soften it and maybe even reduce contrast later in editing, therefore giving you a softer look. Okay, then we've got the photo now. It's time to do some editing, and we're going to start with the tone curve. Specifically, what we want to do in this section is to reduce how white and how black the whitest and the blackest pixels are in the image. So if you click on the bottom left, which does your blacks, and slightly slide it up, and then click on the top right point and slightly slide it down. And what that's going to do is take the whitest pixel in your image, make it slightly off-white, and take the darkest pixel of the image and make it more like very dark gray and not pure black. Now, if for whatever reason the image looks a little bit flat, there's two things you can do. The first thing is to add an S-curve to the tone curve, and all that's going to do is just introduce some contrast into the whole image. Or a method that I personally prefer in this particular scenario is to add contrast locally using a brush adjustment. Simply take a brush adjustment, increase the contrast, and brush in the areas of the image that you feel needs to have a bit more contrast. Assuming you took the photo in good light, you should now have a very clear source of light or a very clear brighter area of the image that you can work with. The first thing I'll do is grab a radial filter and drag it over the lighter part of the image. Then I will take the feather, make sure it's at 100, therefore the filter is as smooth and as gradual as possible. I'll then readjust the filter size just to make sure it covers the image well. Now, in many cases I try to have the center of the filter slightly off the image unless it's a very clear and bright source of light like the sun. In this particular example, because we don't see the sun or that source of light, we want to have the center just slightly off the image so it creates a more natural look. With the filter in place, it's now time to do some adjustments, and the first thing is to increase the general exposure and decrease the contrast. How much you increase the exposure by will be entirely up to you. However, normally it'll be about a stop to 2 stops in some cases. In terms of reducing the contrast, literally just a tiny bit is usually enough just to take the edge of that particular area. If the source of light is coming from the sky or from the sun, I will add a touch of warmth using the temperature adjuster, or if the source of light is coming from like a neon sun or something like that, I can even cool it down. But in most cases, I do this for sunlight, therefore I will warm up the image or that particular radial filter. Next up, I will slightly drop the blacks, and what that will do is slightly bring a bit of contrast back into that particular area. And finally, I will reduce the clarity. Now, I don't do this all the time, but in most cases, around -10 is enough to again soften that particular area down. Now, don't go too much here because we will be looking at global clarity later on, but around -10 will be perfect. At this point, you're probably wondering, well, the image looks completely overexposed, it doesn't look good. Well, this is where you take the global exposure, bring it down a touch, and you will probably find that it looks pretty good right now. And then you can use the highlights and the shadows sliders afterwards to just really fine tune the overall look. Let's start with sharpening, and this is something that you really want to be doing very selectively. The worst thing you can possibly do is apply global sharpening to the entire photo. The easiest way to do this is to go into your sharpening settings and set the mask to at least 80, if not more. What that does is it only applies the sharpening just to the very edges and the most, let's say, prominent details of your image, and then it ignores the more flatter and then less detailed parts of the image. Now, if you press and hold Option on a Mac and then slide it, you will see an outline of what's actually been sharpened and what's not. In terms of how much sharpening to use, honestly, I've always just left it at the default, which is 40. Any time that I felt I needed to add a bit of sharpening, I would actually use the second method, which is again using a brush and selectively painting in. So usually if I need to add more than 40 sharpening, which is the default, I would literally paint in maybe the tiny fraction of the image which I think needs that sharpening, and then increase it to maybe 50 max. But generally, as I've said, I try to avoid going above that, because then that kind of undoes a lot of the work that we've done up to now to get a softer image. Now let's look at clarity, and if you've purchased any of my presets, you probably would have found that I always use negative clarity. How much? Usually between -10 and -25 in some extreme cases. Now, typically the sweet spot is around -15. If you tend to go above below -25, the image starts to fall apart and look a little bit silly. So -15 is the sweet spot as a global clarity adjustment. And what I find is negative clarity just takes that digital edge off the image. Now, there might be a part of the image that you still want to maintain clarity, and just like with sharpening, what you can do is just use a brush adjustment and brush in clarity into the particular area of the image that you feel still needs to maintain it, and everything else can remain as negative clarity. In around 95% of cases, everything we've done up to now is enough to give the image a very nice soft look. However, sometimes it just doesn't work, or sometimes we maybe want a little bit more, or we want something a little bit different, which we just can't achieve through Lightroom or Capture One if you're using that. So this is where we can use what's called an Autumn effect, and for that we need to go into Photoshop or Affinity Photo. For this, I'll usually export the image as a TIFF or just click open in Photoshop or Affinity Photo, depending on how you've got your software set up. Now, once in Photoshop, what you want to do is duplicate the background layer, so duplicate the image. And the top layer image, you want to apply a Gaussian blur. Now, in terms of how much, usually I go between 25 and 30. Once that's applied, next thing I want to be doing is adding a levels adjustment. Then the levels adjustment will add a ton of contrast by moving the sliders inwards, therefore making the image look a little bit ridiculous. However, bear with me. At this point, you want to merge everything into one layer. Once merged, just hide the two middle layers, so you have the merged layer at the top and the original image at the bottom. So the top image, you want to now reduce the opacity to around 10%, and you'll find you have a very nice autumn soft effect on your image. Now, if it's a little bit too much, you can just change the blending mode to overlay, and then that will slightly increase the contrast, but then reduce the blurriness or the softness of the image. Okay, that's literally everything. So as you can see, there aren't that many steps involved, and the adjustments we've made are generally quite minor. However, we've gone from an image that started out looking like this to an image that ended up looking like this, and we haven't even touched any of the other adjustments. So I hope you can take a few of these things away from this video. You don't have to implement everything in your photography, but maybe 1 or 2 things will help soften the image down and give you that soft, nice look without having to buy overpriced and slightly crappy filters, in my opinion. Anyway, now before I go, I just want to thank you for your time watching and leave you with the sponsor of this video, which is Squarespace. Now it's time for a quick shout out to this video's sponsor, Squarespace. They gave me a platform to make my own online portfolio so I can share my photos outside of social media. Squarespace also allowed me to give my photos context by turning them into written blogs. This allowed me to elevate the quality of my work, rank in search, and provide others with value. If you always wanted your own corner of the internet, may I recommend using Squarespace as your tool of choice. If this is something that interests you, click on the link below for a free trial and then 10% off your first purchase. Thank you to you for watching this bit of video, and thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring.